the Mayans would on their big stela and stone sculptures would put in dates that were like hundreds of millions of years in the past. They had this fascination with vast numbers. They charted, all the movements of a lot of the planets incredibly accurately, Venus and so on, the moon cycles. And what they seem to have proposed is that the year 2012, specifically the date December 21st, 2012, is the end of a vast cycle in human development. So what does this mean? And how did they figure it out? There's a book called Myocosmogenesis by this guy, John Major Jenkins, and he did a lot of work to understand their kind of astronomical system. And that 2012, December 21st, 2012, represents this alignment between the solstice sun rising in the middle of this dark rift at the center of the Milky Way. So it's this kind of direct alignment with this the center of the galaxy. And they referred to this dark rift as the cosmic mother. The sun was the first father. The dark rift was the cosmic mother, or it was a black hole. They called it a black hole. And only in the last 5 years have our Western astronomers discovered there is a huge black hole at that spot. So Jenkins says once again, it seems like somehow or other they're accessing a kind of knowledge which begins to correspond with our knowledge system. So they're getting it from some different means. And that Jenkins suggests that this is kind of like, it's also kind of like this cosmic crossing where the sun and the sort of equator come together. And he suggests that it could be like a crossing of the galactic equator, just in the way you have like a magnetic field effects, a reversal above the sort of equator on the Earth, so that forces spin in the opposite direction. There could be some kind of field effect reversal when we cross this plane in the galaxy. So it could be a shift from kind of material, physical, dense reality to a more kind of like psychophysical plane of reality. So he's got one way of looking at it. Basically, I said there are all these different theorists who are coming at this thing from different angles. Another person who had it in a way that I think was really interesting is this guy, Carl Johan Kalaman, who's a biologist who's working for the World Health Organization. And he began to look at this kind of idea that the Mayan pyramids were the nine-step pyramids were actually indicating a 9-stage process in the evolution of consciousness, where each stage is 20 times more accelerated in linear time. And so the bottom stage goes back like around 16 billion years ago, sort of Big Bang-ish. Then it's 800 million years, then 40 million years, and then now we're on the 8th stage, which started in 1999. And each stage, in each of these stages, there's like a 13-part process. So it's like now this stage that started in 1999 is a little under 13 years in length, and each stage in that process is a little under a year. And the previous stage started in 1755, and each stage there is roughly 20 years, 19-point-something years. And the stage before that started around 3,125 BC, and each stage is about 400 years. So there's this acceleration. And the book is called The Mayan Calendar and the Transformation of Consciousness. And I think it's very mathematical and formalizes this thing really, really well, and gives you a sense that there's almost like this energy current, this kind of movement, this sort of creative and destructive pattern in each of these phases. You can check it out to see if it seems to correspond to how things have kind of changed and evolved. And so basically, according to Kalaman's model, since 1999, we're experiencing as much change, novelty, development, intensification of consciousness in 1 year as people were experiencing before 1999 in roughly 20 years, and before 1755 in roughly 400 years. So that's his model, and it's sort of up to, I don't think you can, beyond his evidence for it in this kind of matrix that she's put together, it's a question of whether that seems to correspond to anything that people find to be legitimate. And one thing that interests me about his thesis is or one way I think that helps to substantiate it, or is to think about it, is if you think about the concept of a generation gap. Like back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was this idea of a 20-year generation gap. And it was actually like people who were 20 years separate from each other in age really like could not communicate. There was a communication barrier. It was almost like they were on a different frequency of consciousness, let's say. And that no longer seems to be the case at all, because the pace of acceleration and evolution has just moved to a whole different level. That kind of generation gap no longer seems to be part of the picture. And so, I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Kalaman gets very, very specific about when there might be kind of big changes in terms of a kind of futurological predictions of what we can look forward to in the future. So basically, 2012. So I studied this Mayan calendar stuff, and I also, if you take shamanism seriously, basic idea is kind of synchronicities. That basically there's some kind of interrelation or intersection or correspondence between like your personal reality and your kind of psychic reality. Your kind of the physical world and your inner psychic world are actually in communication and in correspondence, and that synchronicities are often these kind of clues from the the sort of what we see as the physical world into the workings of our psychic reality. That there's a kind of continuum there. That's not a dualistic separation. And I began to have a number of synchronicities around 2012. One was that I had a friend who'd written a long poem about sort of corporate globalization and the oil crisis, but he also talked about the Mayan calendar and ayahuasca. And I had a small publishing house. I was going to publish his book, and then I didn't want to really deal with it because it was really depressing, basically. And I had all these quotes from left-wing critics and so on. So I put it off, and finally one day I was like, all right, I got to deal with Michael's book, So I opened the book and I started to work on it, and suddenly there was this sickening, crazy noise out the window, and we opened the blinds, and there was the World Trade Tower burning down, and it was 9/11, 2001, and the book was titled "World on Fire," And so in that book, he looks at this year 2012 as being a kind of literal apocalyptic kind of end date, where we go into this kind of road warrior scenario where we're like running out of fuel and people are just sort of totally lost in a situation that's collapsed. So I had a number of kind of signals like that just seemed to be coming really, really strongly. Then I also, I mean, Carl Jung wrote famously about synchronicity. There's also a physicist, F. David Pete, who wrote a really beautiful book called Synchronicity, the Bridge Between Mind and Matter, where he really looks at this idea that when you have these like synchronicity events or the kind of like creative breakthroughs or certain kinds of intuitive leaps like that, it's almost like you're connecting with this deeper order of the mind, and you feel it as a kind of click, as a kind of shift into a momentary shift into kind of a different order of possibility, a different order of creativity. And he proposes in that book, which I think was probably written in the 80s, he worked with David Bohm, but he proposes that these experiences of synchronicity, these shifts, suggest the possibility of a sort of different kind of shift. That would be a shift into a different order, a more kind of synchronic order, where time would actually be experienced differently, where you'd be having these kind of breakthroughs, sort of continuously, rather than it just being this every now and then kind of emergence into this other consciousness. I also was very interested in Terence McKenna, who's the sort of psychedelic theorist and figure in the 80s, who'd also had a whole experience around 2012 while working with psychedelic mushrooms in the Amazon, and had ended up putting together this whole different kind of model of time, this idea that that our experience of sort of linear time that we're having now is only one way of experiencing time, that there can be breaks into different orders of time or different lived experiences of time. And he sort of attempted to formalize that mathematically also. So it was just like this 2012 kind of thing kept coming from all directions, in a sense. And for me, I think it's somehow it's a kind of archetype that's constellating. I mean, I never bought Y2K. I was very unconvinced by Y2K. It just seemed totally silly to me. I never thought the computers were going to fritz out on us, and but I've sat with this stuff a long time, and I looked at it from a lot of different dimensions. And I guess for me, the sort of most compelling aspect has just been my own lived experience as I've been exploring this whole paradigm, which has been the sense of a continual intensification of synchronistic events, psychic events, telepathic events, almost a sense of increasing psychic manifestations. And a lot of the people I know have been experiencing the same kind of thing. One way I think to look at this possible shift, and as I said, there's a whole bunch of different angles. I mean, if we look at if you look at I would say the three major things that point towards the conclusion that we're entering a sort of epochal shift. I mean, not just like an incremental shift. I mean, we have the ecological crisis, which is global warming, species extinction. According to analysts, within 30 years, 25% of all mammalian species will be extinct if we continue on the same path that we're in. And as we're getting this data, we're simultaneously learning how deeply interconnected ecosystems are. So, I think even the UN has reported that we're down to like 10% of a lot of types of fish in the oceans and so on. So we're ripping through our ecosystems in a way that may not be repairable by natural means, unless we really come to like an abrupt point where we are able to kind of, as a species, massively shift our practices and do a kind of ecological U-turn in how we're approaching the planet. So that's one piece. And the other piece is this incredibly accelerated evolution of technology. So that, and for me, like what's happening with technology is literally changing our kind of lived experience of being individuals. It's a very profound shift in that, we sort of went through this from the Renaissance to the 20th century. Like we developed this very strong sense of ourselves as alienated individual identities, kind of ego-centered. And I think what's happening with like all these advanced social networking capabilities, with cell phones, it's almost like the self is becoming a little bit softer, like a little bit more mediated. There's a sense that like that hard individuality is melting a little bit, softening at the edges, and so on. So those two aspects, and then the third aspect for me is this psychic evolution. So if you look at the seventh step on the Mayan calendar, which was 1755, at that point was the Industrial Revolution. And one of the main things that happened was we understood electricity. So up until that point, people had seen lightning, and they'd experienced static shocks and so on, but they had no concept that you could take electricity down into the world and use it as a transformative energy to change the whole planet. And once they figured out how to do that, in basically a blink of evolutionary time, a century and a half, we changed the whole surface of the Earth, which is a pretty remarkable thing to have done. And we now live in a fully electronic and electrified reality. It's pretty astonishing. So what if we're at a same threshold and juncture in terms of psychic energy or psychic phenomena, that more and more people are becoming cognizant of this reality of psychic energy, and what if there's a kind of tipping point or threshold where that becomes something that we are able to use as a transformative energy for the world?